This video will give you an introduction to discourse analysis. So what is it? Discourse analysis is the study of written or spoken language, but it is in relation to a social context. So discourse analysis focuses on how language is used in real life and is sometimes referred to as talk as action. So what might it focus on? The purposes and effects of different types of language, the ways in which cultural rules and conventions are embedded in how we communicate. Might look at revealing and understanding the way in which language both creates, perpetuates, and communicates values, beliefs, and assumptions, as well as understanding how language is related to social, political, and historical contexts. So what kind of data do we use when we do discourse analysis? Of course, sometimes we do interviews or analyze conversations from real life, but there are many other extant forms of data that can be used and are used for discourse analysis. Published work like newspapers or periodicals, things like advertisements, documents, for example, curriculum documents, government reports, policy manuals, and also social media provide sources of data for doing discourse analysis. One of the things that is key, though, to remember is that discourse analysis looks at big chunks of data well beyond the sentence. So we contrast discourse analysis with linguistic analysis. And in the right-hand figure, you see these ever larger circles that give you a sense of the sort of expanded notion of how analysis of language, conversation, text continues to get bigger, and discourse analysis is the largest container among those. But there are many things that we can look at. There are many things that we can analyze when we do discourse analysis. We may look at vocabulary, and that seems like a micro level, but we may look at words and phrases and the ways in which those create association, whether it's about understanding the formal or informalness of relationships as perpetuated through the use of language. We may look at grammar, that is, the way in which sentences are structured. We look at it to see, though, the way in which that language is embedded in a context. Perhaps the classic example of this is William Labov's work, in which he illustrated that the language of Black African Americans was not simply a downgraded mainstream English, but had a very complex grammatical structure of its own, what came to be called Black English vernacular. We might look at structure. We might consider a body of work in a sense as a genre. So political speeches or advertisements are a good example. Of course, communication is primarily, we think of it as primarily verbal, but we can also look at nonverbal behavior as it relates to the ways in which language and communication create are created in social context. So we might look at the tone of voice that people use, whether or not and what kinds of gestures are used, whether there are particular ways in which forms of speech are invoked in order to create intention or communicate emotion. And we can look at conversational codes. What are more commonly examples are things like turn taking or interrupting, waiting as part of conversation. There are many studies that look at the differences between men and women and the ways in which conversational codes are used by men and women, for example. One variation on discourse analysis is critical discourse analysis. And this really, as is often the case when we add the adjective critical to a methodology, signals to us that we're focusing this methodology on looking at power relations and social structures. One of the things about critical discourse analysis is that it is typically a descriptive approach, that it looks at trying to understand and to reveal what the inequities are as embedded in language and communication, and maybe how those are perpetuated by language as well. So CDA doesn't necessarily offer up the intention for change like some other critical approaches do, although it may. Michel Foucault is the name that's most often associated or widely associated with critical discourse analysis. And a key idea in CDA is this notion of deconstructing discourse. And oftentimes people talk about it, the deconstruction in these three contexts: historical, cultural, and discursive. So we can look at the way in which discourse has developed historically, what's used today wasn't always. How has it come to be that we have this now, and it constructs an experience for us that's different from what it was in the past? Culturally, we can look at differences and learn something about the ways in which language in different cultures creates meaning and relationships that may lead to inequities. And discursive, the idea of wordplay, again, going back to looking at some of those perhaps more microstructures, uses of words, structure, codes, and so on, and how those may create the conditions of hegemony. So if you're interested in learning more about discourse analysis, I would say look to Michel Foucault for the really big ideas. His writing is dense and not necessarily easy to read, but important theoretically and as a framing for doing discourse analysis. And look to the work of Norman Fairclough for more pragmatic how to do it information on discourse analysis. And I've given here an example of an exemplary study, Stuart Hall's classic piece of work, the book Policing the Crisis. It was published, I believe, in the late 70s, and is an analysis of the ways in which, in this case, using the word mugging, which was maybe is a bit antiquated now, but the idea of low-level street crime and its interconnections with issues of power and race and the law and policing. Indeed, probably a timely work to revisit for all kinds of reasons at the moment. So there you have discourse analysis.